Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello and welcome to episode 105 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. My name is Jesse Kramer. Later today, Bill Yount will be joining me. Bill is the co-host of Catching Up to FI. FI is in financial independence. It's a podcast targeted toward late starters who now need to play a little bit of catch up in their financial lives, but certainly still can achieve financial independence if they right the ship in time. And Bill has a lot of interesting lessons to share with us, especially targeted towards, late bloomers to personal finance investing and financial independence. But before Bill joins us, I have some thoughts to share. And as always, we're going to start off with a quick review of the week. This one comes from MXXXHXX. That is a lot of X's. And the title of this review, it's a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. The title is Great Job Explaining Retiree Issues. I recently spent a fair amount of time finding and educating myself on Roth conversions. Today, I listened to Jesse's podcast number 99, and it was all there in a few minutes of discussion. Well, MXXX, I'm glad this was helpful. The podcast has been helpful for you in your retirement planning. It's certainly a topic that I'd love to talk about. And if you shoot me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog, we'll get you hooked up with a super soft podcast t-shirt. Okay, before Bill joins us today, I have a couple old articles, interesting thoughts I wanted to share. Again, targeted towards maybe some late bloomers or some people who are just discovering the world of personal finance and investing themselves. And then I'm recording this in late March, and we've had a pretty tumultuous March and part of February too in terms of investing in the stock market. So I want to share some thoughts with you guys about this concept of buying the dip, which is essentially, holding onto cash, to some extent, maybe hoarding cash, waiting for a market to go into a minor correction, a bear market, an outright crash, and then boom, you pounce and invest once the price crashes. It's a concept that on its face makes a lot of sense, but I think as you'll hear today, there's much more to it than meets the eye, and more often than not, it actually might not be worthwhile. So we'll get to that article and those thoughts eventually, but first, a couple articles, some thoughts targeted towards, again, the late bloomer. So the first one is called The Stupidly Simple Secret Sauce of Personal Finance. Some people out there, you'll hear them say, take your income, divide it into 5 equal buckets, take each bucket, multiply it by your age. If Mercury is in retrograde, convert 2 buckets to Bitcoin. Otherwise, use 14% of your future Social Security income calculated pro rata and buy lottery tickets, something like that. Well, that is stupidly complicated, but people understandably, they yearn for hidden knowledge, for secret knowledge, the secret sauce, and they hear things like that rambling that I just had, and they go, oh, that sounds like secret sauce to me. Maybe that's what I need to do. But personal finance does not have to be complicated. The real secret sauce of personal finance, in fact, is incredibly simple. So we're going to talk about 4 stupidly simple rules first off the bat. The following 4 rules, they aren't highlighted enough in the personal finance space, or maybe they are, but I think maybe because they're so simple, we overlook them. But these rules provide the easy answer to, for example, how a frugal teacher can end up in a better financial scenario than some slick Wall Street banker or than some doctor. As you'll hear later today, Bill Yount is an emergency room doctor. And despite spending the first maybe 20 to 25 years as a doctor after medical school, he still ended up in a position where, he was a little bit lost financially. And it's because, I think you'll hear him attest to this fact, he didn't have all these 4 rules in place. And they are: number 1, spend less than you earn. Number 2, double down on the above and spend way less than you earn. Number 3, find ways to earn more money, but don't increase your spending while you do so. And then number 4, invest. Make your money grow on itself. As hopefully we all know, but even today, this morning with a client, I had this conversation that there are 2 equally important inputs to the final product of good financial planning. The first input is how much money comes in. The second input, or maybe it's an output, but it's how much money goes out. It's how much you spend. And we all love to focus on money coming in, right? Salary. If not for salary, how would I compare myself to another human being? Asks many of the modern Midases around us. But salary alone or income alone, that's an incomplete statistic. Much like in a way that batting average was described in Michael Lewis's Moneyball, if you're familiar with that. It accounts for some results, but it does not account for all results. And that's why savings rate is a much better statistic, at least when it comes to personal financial health, because, saving 50% of your income is noticeably better than only saving 10% of your income. And it doesn't matter whether you're a teacher or a banker or someone else. Whereas if we only compare salaries alone and we say, well, someone's earning 50% more than someone else, that's not enough to really come to a good conclusion. My second stupidly simple rule of personal finance is that the winners are loud, but the losers stay silent. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we've all seen a headline that looks something like this. 28-year-old turns $30,000 into 1 million with Tesla stock or with Bitcoin or with something like that. We love winners. We love the stories of, woman gets rich off of great stock pick, man shorts a company right before it goes bankrupt, dog digs a hole in the backyard and owner finds gold. We love those stories. Planet Money had a great episode a couple years ago on people making money off of a Hertz, the rental car. They had a bankruptcy, and then they had this subsequent roller coaster of their stock price, and a bunch of people made a bunch of money off of that fact. And much like a roller coaster, making money creates this wild and exciting curiosity. Who doesn't like a story about someone making lots of money? The Big Short, it's one of my favorite books and movies. Making billions of dollars is a cool story, but people are rarely publicized when they screw up. Mundane failures aren't in vogue. They never really have been. Man spends $50,000 on silver coins and never really sees a return. A woman neglects free retirement accounts and regrets her choice. Some bros buy crypto at the top and they lose their shirts. Oh, those aren't stories that stick with us. They aren't stories that are written about, but they should be. Right? Those should be the stories that we hear, and they should be cautionary tales of what not to do. Instead, we hear stories through the filter of survivorship bias, right? The winners make the cut, and we hear those stories. The losers don't get publicized. For every winner you hear about, you should consider the silent losers. Your slow and steady solution, it might seem lame compared to the people who are taking rockets to the moon, but a lot of those rockets actually blew up on the pad, and we shouldn't forget that fact. The next stupidly simple rule is that boring is best. Picking stocks, it's fun. So is picking horses. But unless you're really, really good at it, it's probably a losing bet for you. And let's face it, most of us are not really good at that. There's some really good breakdowns out there, and I've written one or two I'll share in the show notes about luck versus skill in stock picking. You can't just be above average, right? That's not good enough. You've got to be consistently above average, far above average, for a long period of time. The alternative to such complex stock picking analysis over long periods is to invest in something like a boring index fund. It's what Buffett recommends to a lot of people like us. I mean, he does it his own way, and he's really, really good at doing it his own way. And you're right. He doesn't invest his own money in index funds. Not yet. He said that a lot of his estate would go into index funds once he dies. But the idea is that if you know enough to be like Warren Buffett, well, go ahead, pick individual stocks, buy whole companies, and make your money that way. That's what he does all day, every day. And he's been doing that for over 80 years now, something like that, right? He bought his first stock, I think, before he was 13, and now he's 93 years old. For the rest of us, we might want to do something simpler so that we can go out and live our own lives. And that's not the only one where there's a contrast in personal finance and investing between something that's exciting versus something that's good. Gold and Bitcoin can be exciting. Is saving tax dollars via investing in a 401k, is that exciting? I don't know. It sounds pretty boring to me. And yet maximizing your tax advantage investing accounts, it's one of the best methods for the average American to achieve a healthy retirement. It's like saying, hey, eating carrots and jogging every day, it'll help you lose weight. Great. I bet it would, but isn't there a magic weight loss pill out there or some Himalayan calorie burning meditation technique? We yearn for solutions to be exciting and exotic, but they don't have to be. Boring and rich or exciting and broke. For me, it's an easy choice. My next rule is that you make the economy go. At least in part, you and I make the economy go around. It's our purchases that keep money flowing, and that flow of money greases the wheels of the economy. There's an enormous vested interest in ensuring that average Jane and average Joe spend a significant portion of their incomes. The advertising industry is predicated on that interest, right? Drink this beer because you'll be the most interesting man in the world. Buy this computer so you're not an Orwellian drone. That's a famous Apple ad from 1984. These shoes will make you cool, just like insert your favorite athlete here. We're urged to consume until we're fat and broke. And once obese and opulent, we're urged to lose that weight and store that stuff. And the cycle continues. To the powers that be, you are a consumer. You make the economy go round. Well, something like the fulfillment curve is the antidote to that mindset. If you really know what you're spending and how it correlates to what makes you happy, you'll most likely spend less. And once you have your personal answer to that question, maintaining these stupidly simple rules of personal finance becomes a really easy task. The next one is that measurement is the key to management. Frequent contributor to the Best Interest blog, Peter Drucker, had this famous quote from the 60s or 70s when he was kind of at his peak. And the quote is, "You can't manage what you don't measure." So to manage would be to analyze, take care of, and improve. And to measure would be to watch, to observe, to take notes, to quantify. Let me present two people to you. One of them tracks every single calorie she eats. The other one pays no heed to what she slides down her gullet. All else being equal, who do you think is going to end up healthier? Now, the first instinct, it's the woman who measures all of her food intake. Why? Well, because we know that her abundant self-knowledge is likely going to lead her to make smarter food choices. The woman who doesn't care, well, she doesn't care, and that's probably going to lead to worse food choices. And the same exact principle applies to personal finance. You don't have to track every single dollar, and you don't have to check your accounts on a daily basis, but you should have a really good idea of where your money is going and where your net worth stands. Are you improving? Are you slumping? Are you spending thousands of dollars on Nepalese meditation retreats? Measure your money and then improve. Now, what happens if you don't follow some of these stupidly simple rules? The secret sauce, the stupidly simple secret sauce? Well, you might end up something like Dave. And in July 2020, I wrote this article. Do you know Dave? Somewhere in middle America, there's a man named Dave. You might know him. Today, for the first time ever, Dave is realizing that he's in a financial death spiral. Dave makes about $60,000 per year. He knows he pays some taxes, but he's not sure how much. All Dave knows is that his monthly take-home income ends up around $3,000. Right off the top, Dave pays $1,200 for rent. His apartment is sick, or perhaps on fleek. Pick your parlance of the times. It's a modern, stylish, could easily fit another person in his apartment, but Dave likes to live alone. Fair enough, Dave. And after driving a junky Honda Civic in high school and college, Dave is finally able to afford a nicer car. So he leases, changing cars every 2 years. Currently, he's behind the wheel of an Audi A3. It's $320 a month, but insurance and gas brings it up to about $500 a month. Dave's young. His friends are young. They all like to socialize around town, and a couple drinks and dinner later, the $35 bill comes, and life gets a little slow in middle America. So Dave does this a few times a week, spends about $250 a month on dining out. What about some other stuff? Well, Dave isn't really sure, whether it's Amazon purchases, groceries, gifts for his mom on Mother's Day. Dave knows that he buys these things. It's just that he doesn't really know how much or how often. He's unaware that he's spending another $400 a month on all these things. Like most of his peers, Dave has student loans. He pays $500 a month. And in the 5 years since college, he's paid about $30,000 towards his loans. That's crazy. Now, his statement says he still owes 90 grand out of the original $100,000 in debt. But by Dave's math, 100 grand minus the 30 grand he's paid, well, that means he only owes 70 left. So the loan company must be wrong. He thinks, well, they're not. Dave's dad annoys him about saving for retirement. Get that compound, Dad suggests. That compound? At 27, Dave isn't even halfway to retirement age. He's got more pertinent things to consider than retirement, he thinks. So let's add it up. All of Dave's finances, we just laid them out. And if you've been keeping track, well, good for you, because Dave really hasn't. The first problem is that Dave's total expenses are greater than his income. He makes $3,000 a month, but he spends about $3,100 a month. Now, it's not that big of a difference, right? But for the 5 years since college, that $100 monthly deficit, it ends up on Dave's credit cards. $100 a month multiplied by 5 years, that's about $6,000 of credit card debt. Dave looks at his Visa bill. He sees a charge for $90 per month of interest, and that interest doesn't even affect his $6,000 in debt. What the heck is that? When Dave adds up his net worth, he finds that he's about $90,000 in debt in total. And a lot of people are in lots of debt, he thinks, especially young people, college loans. It's normal, Dave thinks. Well, chronic smoking used to be normal too. And much like an emphysemic, Dave is in trouble. To the outside world, Dave's a reasonable example of a successful young guy, and I'll give Dave some credit. It seems like he has some nice things going for him: education, steady income, nice apartment, nice car. What's not to like? Well, Dave's multiple and repeated financial mistakes are catching up to him, and let's call a few of them out. After working for 5 years, he's decreased his debts by only 10%. He isn't aware of what he spends per month, and therefore he's in credit card debt. Despite being in debt, he's still spending a significant amount of his money on luxuries and fun. And our young years, yes, we want to enjoy being young. They're also some of the best times to invest for retirement, and Dave hasn't done anything there yet. These mistakes are easy to avoid, but nobody ever really taught Dave about them. In fact, I would argue that our economy, much like we just described, it's actually a funnel designed to trap people like Dave. Even though Dave's in trouble, his path to improvement is pretty well defined. He should start off by setting some financial goals. Right now, he's foundering. He's got no real direction. And Dave, much like his dad said, he needs to get that compound, right? Dad is right. Our younger years are the best time to invest. And Dave really needs a budget, or he needs to be tracking his finances somehow, right? Money in versus money out. I used to use the tool, You Need a Budget. I currently use a tool called E105. whatever tool you use, you've got to track your finances. You've got to track money coming in and money going out. Of course, Dave could find some pretty easy ways to spend less. He could get a roommate, drive a cheaper car, spend less at the Fish Fry Friday, whatever it is. In my opinion, those are all secondary effects that occur after he sets a goal, after he creates some sort of budget or tracking system. I mean, maybe Dave really likes his Audi that he's driving. Fine, that's fine. But something in his budget needs to give. It's up to Dave to make that choice. Now, do you know Dave? Can you relate to Dave? Maybe you're even named Dave. At the end of the day, odds are we either know someone or maybe we were at one point this person. Much like the first article I read from, it's very easy to slip into these traps in personal finance, but at the same time, the way we get ourselves out of them can be stupidly simple. And now changing gears, in the light of recent market volatility, and again, I'm recording this at the end of March, where we've had some back and forth volatility. The S&P 500 right now is about 8% off its highs, which, okay, first off, we do need to zoom out and say it's not that big a deal, at least in terms of market history, right? 8% drops happen probably something like 80 or 90% of years have a intra-year 8% drop. So it's not something there we need to be worried about. If we want to be worried about what's going on out in the world, politically, socially, internationally, those kind of things. Totally. I get it. There's nothing wrong with looking at the news, looking at world events and saying, that concerns me. I think there is something different though about tying that into your portfolio and saying, because I'm worried about what's going on, I now need to make drastic changes in investing for no other reason than just looking back at history and realizing that chaos has always kind of been there in the background, whether we realize it or not. World War I, World War II, Great Depression, stagflation, oil crisis, nuclear arms race, Cold War. It goes on and on and on and on and on. There's always been a reason to sell. Did I mention pandemics yet? Anyway, there's always been a reason to sell. And that leads to some people saying, I'm going to buy the dip. And much like birds chirping at the rising sun, investors talk about buying the dip at the first hint of a stock market pullback, correction, bear market. And yes, buying the dip makes sense at first blush because it suggests that we should buy assets at lower or the lowest possible prices. But buying the dip is actually a suboptimal, a bad investing strategy. And we need to talk about why. Now, the basic buy the dip argument is that buying stocks is a risk. The stocks, their prices, they might go down after you buy them. And holding on to cash, that's a risk too. Now, the cash could be invested and could grow with a rising market. That's the opportunity cost of not investing, is that you miss market growth as it grows away from you. Now, either choice, to invest or not, has some sort of risk and reward. The risk is that the market moves in the wrong direction. The reward is that the market moves in your favor. How do we answer whether to buy the dip, whether to wait for the market to drop in price before we buy? Well, we can't predict what the market will do in the future, but we can look at previous market data to backtest a buy the dip strategy. And that's what professionals typically do. And that's what we're going to do today. Usually what we do is if we have some sort of strategy in mind, we look and see how did it perform in past history. Now, before I insult too many people today, we do have to baseline ourselves a little bit. There are two common definitions of buying the dip, kind of like there are two common definitions of dollar cost averaging. It is a little bit confusing. The first scenario of buying the dip is that you've been holding on to lots of cash for many years, waiting for some sort of big crash. And then after that big crash, you choose to buy stocks, is most likely. We're going to talk about stocks today. Now, that is certainly a form of timing the market, but is it the same as buying the dip? I say yes. We'll come back to this. The second scenario is that you're holding a small amount of cash, expecting it to deploy into the market soon. Maybe you did a quarterly or semi-annual review of your financial plan and you realized, you know what? You've got a few $1,000s extra in your bank account that you really don't need. You should invest it. It should go into part of your portfolio. We don't want to find ourselves holding too much cash. So you have this cash, you want to deploy it. And rather than deploying it today, you say, I'm going to give myself a month and I'm going to wait for the first red day in the stock market, the first day of like a 1% drop before buying. Because even if the market only drops that 1%, you end up buying that dip. And then in future situations, when you have a little bit of extra cash on hand, that's the way that you choose to invest. Now, I consider both of these scenarios to be a form of bad, negative market timing. I say that both of these scenarios are a different form of buying the dip. Now, some people disagree with me. Some people, they argue and say that since they're dollar cost averaging anyway, since they're investing money on a monthly basis or on a bi-weekly basis anyway through their 401k or Roth IRA or something like that, well, why not wait for a red day, for a negative day in the market to execute their purchase? Buy low, right? That's the argument. Wait for a red day, buy low, it makes sense. And in those people's defense, I do see a significant difference between the two scenarios I outlined above. It's not just my opinion. The difference that I perceive in these two scenarios, it is backed up by convincing analytical data, which we'll talk about. Holding on to cash for years, stockpiling this cash, waiting for a big dip to then deploy that cash. That is a humongous losing scenario. It could literally cost an investor millions of dollars over the course of a 30-year investing timeline. It underperforms basic dollar cost averaging by as much as 800% in total returns in historical backtests. Now, the other scenario where you're only holding on to cash for a few days or a few weeks or a month, that's a little bit better. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's actually much better than the first scenario, but it's still a losing scenario. Over most historical 30-year investing periods, when we backtest this kind of wait and see, buy the dip, let's wait a few weeks, attempting to wait for that dip would drag your overall portfolio down by about 1% over a 30-year period. And for someone retiring with $1 million, holding on to cash to buy the dip would have cost them something like $10,000 over 30 years. It's not a huge price to pay, but it's certainly not good. And it's not something that you just want to opt into. Why would you opt into losing out on $10,000 on $1 million portfolio? Now, some people would argue, well, you have to wait for a little bigger dip. Wait for the market to crash by 2% before you invest, or wait for the market to crash by 5% before you invest. But the data is clear. The bigger a dip that you're waiting for, the bigger a dip you need to trigger you to turn your cash into stocks, the more painful, the more damage you're doing to your own portfolio. So no matter how big of a dip you wait for, it'll impact your portfolio negatively. And the bigger the dip that you're waiting for, the worse it'll be. The best thing to do is to not buy the dip at all. Some of you might be asking right now, but why? Because we already talked about it. Buying the dip on its surface makes sense because we want to purchase stocks. We want to invest at lower prices. The best way to explain it is with this simple example. Let's say Adam has money to invest, and it's based on when I wrote this article, it's April 2021. And this is using real data, by the way. So on April 1st, the S&P 500 was valued at 4,020 on April 1st, 2021. And Adam decided to wait before buying. He wanted the market to drop so that he could buy the dip. Unfortunately for Adam, the S&P 500 increased by 4.1% in the first 2 weeks of April 2021, from 40.20 to 41.85. Only then, after a 4% increase, did the S&P dip. It dipped by about 1.2% in mid-April, back down to 41.35. So should Adam buy that dip at 41.35, even though 41.35 is much higher than where he was previously sitting at the very beginning of April? It was 40.20, 41.35 versus 40.20. Or should he hold out for an even bigger dip? And what if that bigger dip never comes, right? The market is unpredictable. I bet Adam, or these hypothetical Adams, feel pretty conflicted, full of regret when those things happened. Now, April 2021 was a very typical month in the stock market. On the whole, the market increased about 4% that month, but there were a couple times with a 1 or 1.5% dip. For most months, just like April 2021, the best day to invest is the first day of the month. And for most years, the best day to invest is January 1st. Early is better most of the time, right? The market in general goes up and to the right. And if you know that, if you zoom out on that fact, you'll realize, sure, the market might go down tomorrow or next week or next month or next year. It's possible. But on average, if you just ask yourself this question over any month in market history, you will have realized that investing sooner is better than investing later. Waiting for a dip, it's a losing proposition. A future dip might come, but it usually gets swamped out by the larger gains in the meantime. That's the other thing, right? There's always going to be another 2% down day or 4% down day, or even more, a 6 or an 8% down day, a really scary day in the market. Those days are going to come. I guarantee it. That's the way the market works. But they usually get swamped out by all the gains that occur between now and then. So waiting for lower prices, yeah, it makes logical sense, but we have to ask ourselves, what if lower never comes? The problem isn't buying the dip. The problem is waiting for the dip. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Every week, I send a quick free email to thousands of readers that shares 3 simple things. 1, my new articles and podcasts. 2, the best financial content of the week from all over the internet. And 3, a financial chart that explains some important concept in the news that week. It's a great primer to boost your financial know-how.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
Well, this might not be for you.
But I do hear you, which is why I make it very short, sweet, and full of only the essentials. A whopping 66% of subscribers read my email at least once a month. They're enjoying it, and maybe you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog. Again, that's a free, no strings attached subscription at bestinterest.blog.
And with that, we're going to welcome Bill Yount onto the podcast. Bill is a 57-year-old practicing emergency physician, happily married, family man, but he's got an interesting backstory that's led him to now being the co-host of one of the biggest up-and-coming podcasts out there, Catching Up to Fi. While Bill has spent much of his life caring for other people's health, he never learned, or didn't until recently learn, how to care for his own money and his own financial well-being. He spent first and saved second, didn't know much about investing in personal finance. Seems that he made most of the mistakes in the financial books. And Bill will attest that waking up from that reality was painful, full of what if regrets about his past and even some shame. And we dive into that today. But the recovery has been hard, but incredibly rewarding for him. And now Bill's mission is to help other late starters start now, right? And get others to start as early as possible on their individual journeys to financial independence. So without further ado, let's welcome Bill Yount to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors.
Bill, thank you for joining us today. And as the listeners are now aware of, and especially those who listen to Catching Up to Fi, your story is so resonant with so many people who feel like they're coming to personal finance, they're coming to investing a little bit later in their life. So what was the moment for you that kind of flipped the switch inside your head? And then what were some of the first major steps you took to turn your boat around, as it were, from whatever financial path you were on before to this better financial path now?
Oh, it's funny you mentioned boat, because we had a boat named YOLO. That was kind of the mentality. You know, as you may have mentioned, I'm a physician. I came out of residency with delayed gratification. I thought I deserved a lot of things like the new house, the new car, lived paycheck to paycheck with my wife for the better part of 20 years. We made every mistake in the book. We bought whole life insurance. We had a so-called private investment advisor that was with, and I'll out them, Northwest Mutual, unfortunately. Bought a disability policy from them. Eventually, we were in the private bank at JP Morgan and paid them exorbitant fees to really do us nothing. And they didn't even talk us out of selling. They tried to maybe, but they didn't really try hard, selling at the bottom of the market in the great financial crisis and de-risking our portfolio. So we did that. We were house poor because we'd renovated a house in 2007 that was underwater in 2008. So we were house poor. We had bottomed out in the market and sold. And then we kind of missed because we weren't aggressively saving a lot of the bull market in the 2000s. And so we made what I call the trifecta of mistakes. And we came out the other side of that. I woke up at age 50, let's say, and that's late. How did I wake up at 50? I turned 50 and I realized nobody was going to take care of me but me. And that was a shock. I was ashamed. I had my head in the sand. I didn't know how to pull it out. There began the journey of the late starter.
Can we dive into some of those emotions, Bill? I know it can maybe be a challenging thing to talk about, but it's one thing to get someone to understand the numbers. We do plenty of conversations here on this podcast talking about the numbers. But at the end of the day, a lot of these decisions are emotional in some form or fashion. And you just used a word there, shame. Can you talk us through just some of the challenging feelings when you realize like, oh, I'm not exactly where I want to be, but I've got to do something about this?
There's kind of a universal path for late starters. And there's always a shock to the system, whatever it be, like divorce, loss of a job. There's always a financial shock. And you go, oh my God, I'm not where I want to be. I can't, escape this lack of emergency funds or FU money that protects me from this shock. And so it was shock, it was awe, it was shame, it was regret. You would realize that, as I said, you had your head in the sand. I got lost, as I referred to it, as in the funnel of life. We grew our family. We were focused on our kids. We had a child with developmental challenges that took a lot of focus and money. Life just passed by so quickly in this paycheck to paycheck lifestyle. We unfortunately spent first and saved last around tax time. We did exactly the reverse of what people should do. It's not complicated what you should do, but nobody took me aside and said plastics, like in The Graduate. Nobody told me that save in your 401k, max it out. That's all somebody needed to tell me. And, I'd been saving here and there, but we were single-digit savers. It was what was left over at tax time, and we go, okay, there was no dollar cost averaging. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what a net worth statement was. I didn't know what an expense report was. I just knew if I had money left at the end of the month in my checking account to make sure I could pay off these big credit card bills was, literally hand to mouth. I hate to say, and I'm a physician, remember. I was highly trained, highly educated in how to help people with their health, but I could not help myself with my wealth. So yeah, there's a lot of emotions associated with this. And then it migrates, you wake up and you go, okay, let's give myself grace. Let's pause, try and figure out what happened. Where do I stand? What is my net worth? What are my assets? What are my liabilities? What are my expenses? What am I spending every month? Just figure out where you stand. And then, you plan at that point. You write your investor policy statement. You don't jump in and start working the numbers. You got to work the emotions, which is 80% of the battle. And you get to the numbers, but that's the last step. Investing is really the last step. So you pause, you plan, and then you pivot. You change what you've learned from your mistakes, hopefully, and then you ask for help. You go down the rabbit hole, whether it's books, podcasts, vlogs, your podcast, my podcast at Catching Up to Fi. I call it Me Search because I get to learn from experts like yourself that we have as guests on the show, new nuances to investing every time we record. So you just need to open your ears, open your eyes, ask for help, do your own research, and then with your investor policy statement, which is comprehensive, it isn't just what investments am I going to invest in? It's kind of my estate planning, it's my insurance, it's all these other facets of a financial plan, my giving plan. There's a comprehensive look at this, and people need, like yourselves, financial advisors sometimes to work through these things and put together this plan, and then you invest. I took back my money from JP Morgan. I took it back, put it in Vanguard, and I had read things like The Simple Path to Wealth, Set for Life, I Will Make You Rich by Ramit Sethi. I read these things. Actually, if you can see behind me, I've got 2 or 3 shelves of books.
Yeah.
The thing that happened to me as a physician was I was in analysis paralysis, which is kind of the next emotion. You're like, what do I do? It's overwhelming. And but then you got to learn, how do I take a bite out of this elephant, one small bite at a time to get where I need to go? Hopefully that answers your question.
Oh, it totally does. It totally does. You hit on a few things there that kind of got my brain spinning. One being, you're right. So even in this world of professional financial planning, which certainly can get into some complexities, where do we almost always start the conversation? Well, there's that emotional part of it, or just trying to understand the person we're sitting across from. But when it gets into the numbers, you mentioned 4 things in your response there, Bill. You said, I needed to understand my income against my expenses, and I needed to understand my assets versus my debts. I call those the big 4, and they really are the foundation, numerically speaking, at least, of any financial plan. And it's not rocket science. It is something that everybody out there listening can start to do themselves and can get to completion themselves if they want to, right? It's just this idea of, if you don't understand those numbers and how they interact with your life, you will find yourself in a position where you just say to yourself, I'm uncomfortable with my money situation because I don't understand it.
Often you start with your debts, if you have debt, and you work those out, and then you work towards, you have your emergency fund, your debts, then your savings plan. You follow a cash flow waterfall that I'm sure you've talked about on your show, with the buckets that you put your money in as you flow down that cash flow waterfall. And that's where the boring middle starts. That's really the second phase of being a late starter. You go down the rabbit hole, you learn all these things, you get advice, you get help, you've overcome your regret, shame, and awe, you've given yourself grace, and then you got to work the plan. There's no magic buttons here. You've got to follow, as I didn't actually, the KISS principle of keep it simple, stupid. I went complex. I went all in on the Paul Merriman 10 funds for life portfolio. The first book I'd ever read was by Bill Bernstein, The Intelligent Asset Allocator, where I had to learn how to use a financial calculator in order to figure out some of the things he said. It's not that complex. Start with, say, The Simple Path to Wealth. that may give you enough knowledge to really get started. That's one thing that we always come back to is kind of the gospel of simple index investing. It can get a little more complex later, but you just got to get started because you don't necessarily have the time of an early starter. 35-year-olds, as we said, can feel late. 45-year-olds can feel late. 50-year-olds, 55-year-olds, but it's never too late. When was the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When's the second best time? Today. Late starters got to learn is, you may be working a little longer, but actually it's not necessarily the case. The boring middle can be 10 to 12 years. If you get it right and read the shockingly simple math of early retirement by Mr. Money Mustache, you know what you need to save and invest in order to find financial freedom and independence within 10 to 12 years.
Can you talk about your journey a little bit more? And specifically, I'm thinking about what your rabbit hole period looked like and how long it was from that moment you kind of woke up at 50. You spent some time just deep diving into the Paul Merrimans and the Bill Bernsteins of the world, the J.L. Collins as well. But now, is it fair to say you're in the boring middle? And since you have an understanding of your future financial plan, how long do you foresee that boring middle period being for you?
Well, the analysis paralysis probably lasted a year. It's scary. It's scary to take over your money and do it yourself. Maybe 20% of the people do it and 80% of the people still have a financial advisor, and that is okay. But you need to find the right one. So the boring middle for me is looking like, because we didn't save nothing. I don't know what our net worth was when I woke up at 50. I could probably figure it out, but it'd be pretty complicated. I know where it stands now, and we're about 80% of the way to financial freedom. And so I've gone from 50 to 59. I've got 3 or 4 years left in my 12 to 14-year journey. The problem we have is we downsized our life, but we didn't necessarily downsize all our expenses. And we're needing to pursue a fat fire lifestyle. Lean FI, as you may have talked about, is one thing. Coast FI is another. Standard FI is 25 times your expenses. And then Fat FI may be 30 times your expenses. So, that's where we're kind of at. And I plan on, retiring essentially on time, as most people do at 62 or 63. And what does that mean? I've got to have a plan for what happens after that. It isn't margaritas, Mai Tais, the beach, and golf. It's going to be this podcast. It's going to be educating people on these issues to try and create generational financial literacy, where our kids are better off than we were, because my generation, I refer to it as the average American. The average American is a late starter. I'm in the silent generation. We don't talk about it because of the shame. We are also the lost generation because we went from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans, and nobody told me the difference. My dad had a pension, and all of a sudden in Gen X, I wasn't going to have one, and I had to do it myself, and nobody told me really what a 401k was. So we need to wake up this generation so that our kids' generation doesn't fall into the same traps we did.
So when you wake up someone in this generation, what are the most effective levers that you've seen, either for yourself, Bill, or I'm just thinking of so many experiences you have from your listeners, the most effective levers that a late starter can pull on to start making up for lost ground? Is it simply about earning more, simply about just saving first, saving more aggressively, looking at their budget and really starting to trim the fat? What helps the most?
Well, you've got to maximize your savings rate and create the gap, which means earning more. And that's one of the levers that late starters have to pull. They're in their high income years. Take advantage of that. We went from a, say, 10% savings rate to a 35, 40% savings rate within a year. And guess what? We didn't really feel a difference in our lifestyle. And I was like, oh my goodness, where did all that money go? It just trickled through the sieve of life. And as soon as we harnessed the holes, took our house from 4,500 square feet to 2,800 square feet, we paid cash for cars where we hadn't done that before, and bought used. We got control of our food budget, and well, we haven't gotten control of our travel budget, but you got to let something go there. You've got to look at a balanced life. Personally, I think the live on one income and the two income family, or live on half, meaning 40 to 50%, is a great rule of thumb. And you need to start that early, because as soon as you let lifestyle inflation run away from you, it is hard to unwind that. So, downsizing is a lever, increasing your income, increasing your savings rate, decreasing your expenses. Those are all levers, but you can't forget that late starters have Social Security. That is a backstop and a lever that you have to plan on and pull in your investment plan. It's going to be there in some form or another, whether it's 80% of what it is now, but don't forget about that. It is also a powerful lever.
Diving into that Social Security, any recommendations or in general for the late starters? Does it make sense for them to wait as long as possible? Is it really just a case-by-case basis as to when they elect to start collecting Social Security?
Well, if personal finance is personal, Social Security is very personal. I have to recommend in making this decision, you go to opensocialsecurity.com. It's a website founded by Mike Piper. And generally, in a married couple, the high-income professional, the higher-income professional should try and wait till 70. The advantages are tantamount. They're huge. And then with regards to the other spouse, it's the lower earning spouse, especially if it's a female who has a longer lifespan, you can take it earlier. You can take, your full retirement age these days is 67, but you could potentially take it at 63, 4, or 5. And as long as you have longevity on your side, the crossover point tends to be in your early 80s.
That's exactly aligns with my understanding of the question too. Going back though to your previous answer, Bill, and the interesting changes that you made in your lifestyle and how it seems like to some extent you barely even notice the changes. I would think that's more common for the average listener than they suspect it is. And I guess the other way of putting it is we spend all this money in our life currently, and there's sometimes we don't quite notice the marginal benefit for having spent that money. Do you have any specific stories? You did share some specifics already, but whether it's a listener story or something from Jackie's story or from your own story where it's just like, wow, I can't believe I was spending X per month on this thing and I cut it off and I barely even noticed it.
I want to tell you who Jackie is first. Jackie, my partner, my co-host on the podcast, Catching Up to 5, her story is incredibly inspirational. She woke up at 38 with a net worth under, say, $100,000. And by 49, she was retired with a net worth of $1.3 million, just by making the right decisions. And inspirationally, she never made more than 5 figures. She came from poverty. She knew the value of money and setting her free. She knew the value of an education and increasing her income. And she's a single mom that did it with a daughter. It's just incredible. And another incredible story was my previous co-host, Becky Heptig. She and her husband had a net worth of zero at 50. And by 63, they were retired with $1.3, $1.4 million just because of making the right decisions with their money. That speaks to the path of 12 to 13 years. Both of them kind of followed that path, and everybody has that available to them should they wake up, make a few right decisions, and just follow the path. We had bought luxury cars, and actually we didn't buy them, we leased them, and that's a huge difference. Buy a 3 to 5 year old car for cash. Let somebody else take the depreciation hit. It makes a huge difference. Rob Berger, who was on our show, said cars are kind of a retirement buster. Think about cars over your lifetime. And just like Ramit Sethi says, who cares about the lattes? Make the $30,000 decisions right and, keep your car expenses lower. For example, we were buying luxury cars for $50,000 when we could have been buying a Honda or a Toyota for $25,000. And guess what happens to the difference? You invest it, and there's opportunity costs there that you give up if you buy the expensive car. And it can mean $1 million
right
over 20 years in the portfolio, literally. Do the math, right?
Yeah. Especially, one of the other big costs is housing. And someone might listen to this and say, well, should I stretch for housing? And the answer there is, at the very least, if you go a little bit beyond your means to buy a house, it is expensive. Mortgage costs can be quite expensive, the interest costs you pay. I will say, though, at the end of the day, you have an asset that is most likely appreciating, even if in a small way. Now, personally, I don't view residential, like my personal home, as an investment, but I am comforted by the fact that it's most likely going to retain its value in the long run.
Well, it's a store of equity. But let's say it's a savings vehicle, but I don't view it as an investment either.
Correct.
I view it as a liability because the cash flows out, no inward cash flow. So I think very strongly that a house is a liability. Renting is not a bad thing. You don't have all those ancillary maintenance costs, all the big surprises. You don't have the headaches. And so these days, with the cost of housing and the interest rates, I think there's going to be a generation of longer term renters.
Quite possibly. But I think if you compare that to going back to the car example, right, whether you're buying new or buying used or leasing, at the end of the day, call it 10, 12, 15 years from now, you are going to have a rusty car that no longer works and has no appreciable value. I mean, one way or the other, we all know it's a depreciating asset. And to your point, I think what you're saying is you just want to minimize the pain of that depreciation asset as best you can, however the math works out for you.
That's correct. I mean, minimize the holes in the bucket. Make it leak proof, and then, it'll fill up and flow into your next bucket. Money is potential energy. You create a dam, and then you fill up the lake behind it, and then you release the energy as you need it. I mean, it flows, it's infinite, but it's really, in the end of the day, it's not something we own beyond our death, and it transfers to other people. But you want to try and make a perpetual store of energy that lasts for generations, not just yours.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I still remember it was 2019, and a guy from Fidelity came in to speak to my then employer about personal finance in general and about our 401k plan in particular. There were 60 or so of us who attended, mostly 50 plus years old, clearly with retirement on their minds. And nothing against this individual from Fidelity, but unfortunately, the guy just didn't really know what he was talking about. It ended up being a major disappointment. And a bunch of my colleagues afterwards said, in short, man, we're really thirsty for good financial retirement information. Where do we go find it? Now, does that sound true, listeners, for you and your colleagues? Last year, either in person or via Zoom, I spoke to about 800 employees at 11 different organizations, sometimes about personal finance in general, sometimes about specifics of their retirement plans, sometimes about the nitty-gritty details of Social Security and withdrawal planning and retirement math. The point being, if you're interested in inviting me to come talk money to you, to your colleagues, where you work, that is absolutely something I'm interested in talking to you about. Simply drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog and let's start a conversation. Something on catching up to FI. I mean, have you found anybody who started, was very much a late starter, but now has gone not only to the point of their own retirement planning, but is starting to think about that next generation and all the assets they're going to be able to leave behind, or the long-term impact that they're going to be able to leave behind, whether it's charity or their children or some other long-term cause?
There's a Bill Perkins book that says, die with zero.
Sure.
There's that option where you don't create generational wealth and you maximize your quality of life during life. That's not part of our investor policy statement. I think we do want to leave something for the next generation. It would be nice to have a perpetual money machine that helps them, their kids, their grandkids. You can look at 529s that way. Build up an educational fund that passes down to generations so they don't have to worry about educational costs. Build up a donor advised fund where you can have perpetual giving and they learn about giving as part of their portfolio. Generational wealth is to us important, and you have to plan for that because that means that your number that you need to save maybe need to be a little bit more.
I'm thinking about the late starters who are tuning in right now, or even, I can think of some people, Bill, who are my age, and I know they listen to this podcast, and they're probably considering themselves a late starter. So it's not just the 50 and 55-year-olds. We're going down into the 30s too. But either way, there's always going to be that roadblock in their minds of, I'm a little late to this game, and therefore they might be susceptible to some of the, I'll call them the biggest myths out there when it comes to financial planning in general, or more specifically, late stage financial planning. What are some of the more interesting myths that you and Jackie have heard through your Facebook group, say, Catching Up to FI, or just your work over there? And how have you helped people overcome those mythological false mindsets?
Well, one myth is that risk is to your advantage. There's no magic buttons. And to take on too much risk as a late starter is probably unwise. You really need a 10-year runway for equities, and you could be potentially 100% equities for 10 years, but you need to wind that down as you get closer to retirement. Within 5 years of retirement, that should be wound down. But then you got to be able to sleep at night, and you got to know your risk tolerance, your ability and your need to take risks. Those are two different things. And late starters do need to take some risk. You can't be too conservative because you need growth. but their ability may not be commensurate with their need. And trying to assess that may take somebody as a coach or an advisor to help you figure that out. It may be hard to figure out on your own because, you make a mistake like recent days where you went all in and now we're in a 10% correction and who knows how far that's going to go because of what's happening sort of as a manufactured crisis in the economy that we might have expected and some people did, but not getting too political. You got to stay the course. That's another really important thing for late starters is don't, like I did, let your fear dictate what you do next. And don't time the market. Don't, try and go all out on January 20th and then figure out when you need to go back in. They call it the whipsaw. You have to be right twice to take advantage of timing the market. Don't do it. That's a myth too. What other myths are there? There's no magic button. You've got to stay the course and, do what you would do if you were 35. Do it the same thing at 55. The path doesn't change except for the fact that the older you are, the more aggressive you need to be with savings and having a big gap.
And just as a time capsule, listeners, Bill and we're chatting here on March 11th. This episode probably won't come out for a few weeks, but the S&P 500 right now live is 5573. As Bill alluded to, down about 10% from its highs. We'll see by the time this episode comes out where the market is at. You never quite know. It's a fun, this is one of the fun side effects of podcasting, I think, is you get to have conversations at a point in time and then see what happens from there.
I said, Yahoo, let's buy. And I also said, Yahoo, let's tax loss harvest. And I'm sure you explained those things. And I mentioned it in my community today was, this is your opportunity. Don't forget the tax loss harvest in your taxable accounts. Take the losses now. Let the government help you stomach those losses, and then lower your basis and let it ride. It's only going to go up and to the right. Don't let short-term swings dictate your long-term vision.
Did you chat about the wash sale rule at all in your group when talking about the tax loss harvesting, Bill?
Yeah, you got to be careful at 30, 31 days. But as long as you buy a different index, for example, if you trade total market US for S&P 500, you've avoided the wash sale and you can do it on the same day. But if you try and buy the same thing on the same day or within 30 days prior to and after, you're going to get into a little bit of trouble and you won't gain all those losses.
Yeah. It's interesting. Maybe what we'll do is we'll throw an article in the show notes that I wrote about tax loss harvesting, because on net, there definitely is a benefit there. But as you alluded to, you are lowering the basis of your portfolio, and essentially it kicks the tax can down the road, right? Eventually those capital gains will be realized, or eventually you'll die and pass the assets along to your heirs at a stepped up basis. And so I guess what I'm saying is, most likely for most people, the taxes will come due eventually. It's just a matter of, maybe you're in a really high tax year this year and it makes sense to tax loss harvest to your advantage, because when you kick that can down the road, you'll have some more control over realizing them in a lower tax year, something like that.
You asked about inspirational stories, and it doesn't have to be all paper assets. We had a guest on our show, Monica Scudieri. The name of the show was Mama, Are We Poor? And she had come from poverty, but used real estate to her advantage to get where she needed to go again in 10 to 12 years. And that was her vehicle. You don't have to use stocks, bonds, and alternatives in paper assets to get where you want to go. You can start a business. All these things are maybe a little bit more risky and the more work because it's a job.
Yeah.
I personally choose to be passive.
Well, let's end on thinking about some of the traditional investment advice or traditional just personal finance, financial planning advice that either needs to be drastically modified or tweaked for the late starter. Does anything come to mind as something that you say to yourself, Bill, like, yeah, that really does work if you're 25 or 30 and just getting going. But if you're coming to this situation at age 50, we have to rethink what's going on here.
Compound growth works great if you're young. It works better. It works a little bit better, not better, but as you age, you have less time for doubling. Remember the rule of 72. Generally, 7 to 10 years, you'll double your money, and you're losing doubling time. So you have to save more aggressively. That's a big difference. You have to downsize your life so you have a bigger gap. That's people need to live within their means, not have too much house, as we talked about, not have too much car. But then again, remember, you're investing for the long run. it isn't just a 10 or 15-year runway to your retirement. You've got 30 years ahead of you if all things go well. So it is a long-term investment. And you will more than likely have more than you started with when you retire. So you have to make a plan for that.
Yeah, you just hit on something there. Speaking of myths or misconceptions, that runway or that timeline that we're talking about, right? Let's say I'm 55, I'm listening to this podcast right now. You're right. Some of your dollars might have this 5 or 7 year timeline until you hopefully retire and start spending them. But a lot of your dollars have a runway until you're 70 or 80. They have a 15 or a 25 or a 30 plus year timeline ahead of them. And it's each dollar has its own unique timeline, and it kind of all comprises a total portfolio. So a misconception that I hear is someone says, oh, I'm 58, I'd like to retire by 60. And that's why I've moved my entire portfolio to bonds because it's only 2 years away. And I kind of hear that and say, whoa, so much of your timeline is still a decade plus away.
Well, you need to beat inflation. You can't forget.
Absolutely.
And bonds won't necessarily get you there. You got to have a gap there. Keep your cost of your investments low so that the gap works for you. But remember, inflation is a huge cost. Taxes are a huge cost. And unless you have growth assets, you could be in real trouble later on as your money loses value over 30 years.
Oh, exactly right. I feel like we've covered a lot of interesting, little pockets of information that apply to the late starter today, Bill. And if anyone wants to join your community, because it's more than just tuning into the Catching Up to FI podcast. It really is a community that you've built. How can someone get in touch with you, get in touch with Jackie, and join the conversations that you guys are having?
The first thing I'd recommend a new late starter to do is listen to episode 100. That is the odyssey of the late starter. We tell you exactly, as we've talked about today, the things you need to do. But as far as joining the community of Catching Up to FI, we have a Facebook community of over 17,000 members. We have great moderators. It's a great place to be vulnerable. It's a great place to crowdsource some of your questions. It's a great place to meet people, to take things offline. We have a lot of, like yourself, we have a lot of really intelligent people in that community that are ready, willing, and able to help you with your journey and your questions. And a lot of people will tell their stories. And what you realize is there's commonalities to all of them. And the best part about it is you're not alone. In the podcast, we're trying to have a dialogue. In the community, we're having a dialogue. We're going to start a newsletter that will also allow for a dialogue. So join us at Catching Up to FI. We've had people binge on all 120 some odd podcasts and leave us a review, and it just warms our hearts. As a physician, I've been taking care of people for better part of 30 years, and I've received more gratitude for what we created at Catching Up to FI in the last 2 years than in all those 30 years. So it's an incredible thing. It's a great thing to be a part of this creative community, and it's a great legacy for me to leave this behind.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bill, for all the work you do. And I can't recommend Catching Up to FI highly enough. What else can I say other than thank you and extend my gratitude? And so once again, thank you, Bill Yount, for stopping by Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.